My wife faked her mother's heart attack to stop my vacation. So I didn't come home. She called me crying, saying there was an emergency back home. I dropped everything, packed my bags, and rushed to the airport. And then I found out the truth. And I have never felt so stupid in my entire life. There are moments in a marriage that change everything. Not the big dramatic fights, not the cheating scandals, not even the divorce papers sitting on the kitchen table. Sometimes it's one single phone call, one lie, one moment where the mask slips just enough for you to finally see what's been there the whole time. That's exactly what happened to me. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why I booked a one-way ticket and why I have zero plans to go back. Stick around because this story goes deeper than you think. Let me give you a little background because context matters here. I'm 38 years old. I've been married for 9 years. We have no kids, which is actually relevant to this story, so keep that in mind. I work remotely as a freelance software consultant, which means I work from home, I set my own hours, and I spend probably 70% of my waking life inside our house. My wife, let's call her Dana, works a standard 9 to 5 in HR at a mid-size company. She leaves at 8 in the morning, gets back around 6, and somewhere in the middle of those hours, I'm sitting at my home office desk, staring at code and slowly losing pieces of my sanity. That sounds dramatic, and it kind of is, but let me explain. Working from home sounds like a dream until you realize that when you never leave the house for work, the house never feels like a place you can rest. The couch where I'm supposed to decompress after a long day is the same couch I sat on during lunch. The kitchen where I make breakfast is 30 steps from the desk where I spend 8 hours writing code. There's no physical separation between work and life, and after a while, your brain starts to blur the two together. I've been feeling burned out for about 2 years at this point. Not just tired, burned out. The kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. I wasn't sleeping well. I had stopped exercising. I'd gained about 20 pounds. I was snapping at Dana over small things. I was distracted during conversations, and I honestly couldn't remember the last time I felt genuinely happy doing something. I just felt like I was going through the motions. Dana knew this. We'd talked about it multiple times. I'd said very clearly on more than one occasion that I needed a break. Not a vacation with relatives. Not a trip where we visit her parents and spend 3 days listening to her dad talk about his boat. I needed a real break. Time where I could disconnect, think clearly, sleep properly, and come back feeling like myself again. She always nodded when I said this. Always said something like, "Yeah, you should do something about that." But nothing ever changed. Until one day I decided to stop waiting for permission. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. I just finished a particularly brutal project, the kind where the client changes their requirements 4 times in 2 weeks and expects you to smile through all of it. I'd been working 12-hour days for the better part of a month. I closed my laptop, sat back in my chair, and thought, I need to get out of here. So I started researching. I'd always wanted to go to Portugal, Lisbon specifically. I'd seen pictures, watched travel videos, read a few articles about the food and the culture and the neighborhoods, and something about it just called to me. It wasn't too expensive, the weather in spring is beautiful, and most importantly, nobody I knew was going to be there. That last part mattered more than I expected. I want to pause here and say something, because I know some people reading this might raise an eyebrow at the solo part. Why not just take a vacation with your wife? Why go alone? And honestly, that's a fair question. But here's the thing. A vacation with Dana isn't actually a vacation for me. I love her. At least I thought I did. But she's the kind of person who needs to have a plan for every single hour of every single day. She researches restaurants 6 months in advance. She builds spreadsheets for packing. She wakes up at 6 a.m. on vacation days and knocks on the hotel room door if you're not up by 6:15. Being around Dana requires energy. A lot of it. And I didn't have any left to give. So I looked up flights. I found a round-trip ticket from my closest major airport to Lisbon for a reasonable price. I found a small apartment rental in the Alfama neighborhood. A quiet, hilly area with old buildings and little cafes and a view of the river. I booked it for 12 days. I want to be clear, I didn't sneak around doing this. I sat down with Dana that evening and told her exactly what I was doing. I booked a solo trip to Portugal, I said. 12 days. I leave in about 6 weeks. I need this. She went quiet for a moment. Then she asked who I was going with. No one, I said. Just me. Another pause. Why can't I come? I took a breath and explained, as carefully and kindly as I could, that this wasn't about her. This was about me needing alone time to reset. I wasn't running from her. I wasn't angry at her. I just needed space to feel like myself again. I told her she could plan her own trip somewhere while I was gone, or invite her friends to stay over or do whatever she wanted with the 2 weeks. She didn't throw a fit that night. She just got a little cold. Gave me one-word answers for the rest of the evening. I figured she'd come around. She didn't. I didn't fully realize what was happening until I looked back on it later. But in the 6 weeks between when I booked the trip and when I was supposed to leave, Dana ran what I can only describe as a slow, calculated guilt campaign. Started small. She'd mention in passing how she felt left behind. She'd sigh when she saw my travel packing list on the kitchen counter. She'd say things like, "Must be nice to just take off whenever you feel like it," while she was washing dishes, not looking at me. Little comments. Little jabs. Nothing big enough to start a real fight over, but consistent enough to keep a low-level pressure on me at all times. Then it escalated slightly. She started bringing up money. We weren't struggling financially, not at all, but she started making comments about the cost of the trip. 12 days in Europe is a lot of money. I'd remind her that I'd been saving up and this was within budget. She'd drop it, but then bring it up again 3 days later from a slightly different angle. Then came the health angle. About 3 weeks before my departure, Dana suddenly started becoming very interested in whether I was eating properly and sleeping enough. Not in a loving, caring way, in an ominous way, like she was building a case. She'd say things like, "You seem really run down lately. Are you sure traveling alone is a good idea right now?" Again subtle, but it added up. By week 5, I was starting to feel guilty just for looking forward to the trip. And I want you to really think about that for a second, because it's important. I was being made to feel guilty for wanting to take care of my own mental health. That's not a small thing. I talked to my friend Marcus about it. He's been my closest friend since college, and he's the kind of person who tells you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. I laid out everything, the comments, the sighs, the subtle jabs, and he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Bro, she's trying to make you cancel the trip." I knew he was right. I just didn't want to say it out loud. But I didn't cancel. I kept packing. I kept planning. I told myself that Dana was just hurt and she'd get over it once she saw that I came back refreshed and better for it. I was being optimistic. Foolishly optimistic, as it turned out. The flight was about 9 hours. I slept through most of it, which was already a miracle because I hadn't slept that well in months. I landed in Lisbon just before noon on a Wednesday. The sky was this ridiculous shade of blue that you just don't get in the Midwest. The air smelled different. The city was loud and warm and alive, and I remember standing outside the airport with my backpack and my carry-on and feeling, for the first time in what felt like years, like I could breathe. I took a taxi to the apartment. The host had left me a key in a lockbox and a handwritten note on the kitchen table with local restaurant recommendations. The apartment was small and a little worn in that charming, lived-in way. Tile floors, wooden beams, a window that looked out over a narrow cobblestone street. I dropped my bags, sat on the edge of the bed, and just exhaled. I'm not gonna lie, for a moment I felt guilty. Not because I was doing anything wrong, but because that's what 6 weeks of subtle manipulation does to you. Plants a seed of guilt so deep that even when you're sitting in a beautiful apartment in Lisbon doing absolutely nothing wrong, you feel like you're getting away with something you shouldn't be. I shook it off. I ordered a pastel de nata from the bakery downstairs. That's a little Portuguese custard pastry, and if you've never had one, I'm sorry for you, and I went for a walk. That first day I walked for 5 hours. Just wandered. No plan, no schedule, no spreadsheet. I went up hills and down hills. I sat at a miraduro that's a viewpoint and watched the sun hit the river. I ate grilled sardines at a tiny restaurant where the menu was handwritten on a chalkboard. I had a glass of wine at 4 in the afternoon because I could. By the time I got back to the apartment that night, I felt genuinely happy. Not the kind of happy where you're distracted from your problems, The kind where your problems shrink down to their actual size and you realize you're going to be okay. I texted Dana a photo of the view from the Miradoro. Just a simple, made it, it's beautiful. She replied with a thumbs up emoji. I went to sleep early and slept 8.5 hours without waking up once. I want to describe these few days to you because they matter. They're not just filler. They're the contrast that makes what happened next hit so hard. Day 2. I rented a bike and cycled along the waterfront. I stopped at a bookstore where the entire floor-to-ceiling walls were covered in books and the building used to be a convent. I had a long lunch by myself at a restaurant overlooking the sea, reading a novel I'd been trying to finish for 8 months. In the evenings, I'd sit on a little terrace above my apartment with a glass of wine and just watch the city get dark. Day 3. I took a train to the town of Sintra, about 40 minutes outside Lisbon. There are these fairy tale castles up in the hills there, brightly colored and half hidden in the trees. I hiked up to one of them in the morning, then walked down through little streets lined with shops selling ceramic tiles and pastries. I talked to a Dutch couple who had been slow traveling through Europe for 6 months. They asked me what I did and I said, "I'm on vacation," and it felt like the truest sentence I'd said in a long time. Day 4, I did almost nothing. Woke up at 9, made coffee in the apartment, read for 2 hours on the couch, walked slowly to a neighborhood cafe for lunch, took a nap in the afternoon, and then wandered through a flea market in the evening. Nobody needed anything from me. Nobody was sighing in the next room. Nobody was dropping hints. I was completely, entirely, uninterrupted. I called my mom that evening. She asked how I was doing and I told her I felt more like myself than I had in 2 years. She sounded relieved. She'd been worried about me. Dana and I had exchanged a few texts. Nothing much. She'd sent me a picture of the dog. I'd asked how work was going. She said fine. Felt normal. Maybe even hopeful. I should have known things were going too well. I was sitting at a small outdoor table at a cafe in Moraria, the oldest neighborhood in Lisbon, eating breakfast. The neighborhood has this raw, unpolished energy that I loved. Fado music coming from somewhere down the street, old men playing cards outside a bar at 10 in the morning, laundry hanging between the windows of the buildings above. My phone rang. It was Dana. I picked up, expecting the usual, an update about something at home, maybe a question about where I'd put something. But her voice was different. She was crying. Not sobbing, but that controlled, barely holding it together kind of crying that is almost more alarming than full-on sobbing. "I need you to come home," she said. I asked what happened. She told me her mother had been rushed to the hospital. Chest pains. Possibly a heart attack. She said the doctors were worried, and she didn't know what was going to happen, and she couldn't handle being alone right now. My stomach dropped. Now, I want to be honest with you here, because this is the part that I'm not proud of. My very first instinct, in the half-second before the panic set in, was a flash of suspicion. I almost immediately suppressed it, because what kind of person hears, "My mother might be having a heart attack," and thinks, "Is this real?" That felt monstrous to me, so I pushed it down hard and went into husband mode. I told her I was so sorry. I asked which hospital. I asked if her mom had a history of heart problems. I asked if Dana wanted me to call her brother. She answered all the questions in that same carefully controlled, barely crying voice. Then she said, "I really need you here. I can't do this alone." I paused. "And I want you to think about the position I was in. My wife is telling me her mother might be dying. I'm 5,000 miles away. What am I supposed to say?" I told her I would look at flights. "I want you to understand the chaos of the next 3 hours." I went back to the apartment and immediately started searching for flights back home. The next available direct flight wasn't until the following morning. I found a connection through London that could get me home that evening with a 2-hour layover, but the ticket was close to $1,400 because of the last-minute booking. I called Dana back and told her the situation. She said, "Whatever it costs, just come home." I booked the flight. I started packing. I was cramming things into my bag, still not quite believing that 4 days into a 12-day trip I was already going home, but pushing through it because her mother. Heart attack. What kind of husband stays on vacation when his mother-in-law might be dying? I called Marcus while I was packing, just to talk it through out loud. He listened and then asked a question I wasn't ready for. Have you talked to her brother yet? Or anyone else in her family? I hadn't. I'd only heard from Dana. Don't you think her brother would be blowing up your phone too if this were real? Marcus said. I told him to stop it. He went quiet and said, I hope I'm wrong. I genuinely do. Just call her brother before you finalize anything. I almost didn't, but something about the way he said it made me hesitate with my hand on the door handle. Bags already packed. I called Dana's brother. His name is Kevin. I've known Kevin for almost a decade. He's one of those steady, calm guys who takes things in stride. I braced myself for panic on the other end. He answered on the second ring. His voice was completely normal. Hey man, what's up? I said I was calling about his mom. About the hospital. Silence. Then, what about mom? She's fine. I just talked to her this morning. She went to her book club. I stood in that apartment in Lisbon with my packed bag at my feet and the phone against my ear, and the entire world went very, very quiet. Kevin asked me what Dana had told me. I told him. Another silence. Then Kevin exhaled slowly and said, She told you mom had a heart attack? Yes. Dude, mom is fine. I promise you. She called me this morning talking about her roses. She's completely fine. I thanked him and hung up. I sat down on the bed. My bag was packed and sitting by the door. I had a $1,400 flight booked to leave in 3 hours. I had just cut short my first real vacation in years. And none of it, not one single part of it, was real. I called Dana. She didn't pick up. I called again. She picked up on the third try and her voice immediately started doing the barely crying thing again. I cut her off. I just talked to Kevin, I said. Complete silence. I just talked to Kevin, I said again. Your mom is fine. She went to her book club this morning. More silence. For a long, long moment. Then Dana said, very quietly, I was scared. I asked what she was scared of. She started talking about how she didn't like being alone, about how the house felt empty, about how she tried to tell me this before and I never listened. She said she panicked and she didn't know what else to do to get me to come back. I listened to all of it without saying a word. And then I said, I'm not coming home. She started crying harder. Real crying this time, I think. I said, I'm staying for the rest of my trip. When I get back, we need to have a serious conversation. But I'm not coming home early because you made up an emergency to manipulate me into canceling my vacation. She said she couldn't believe I was choosing a vacation over my marriage. I said I couldn't believe she had faked her mother's hospitalization to control me. And then I hung up. I canceled the flight. I lost part of the booking fee, but I didn't care. I unpacked my bag. I put my clothes back in the drawer. I put my toiletries back in the bathroom. And then I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. I want to describe to you what that felt like, because I think it's important. It wasn't just anger. It was this layered, slow-moving feeling that came in waves. First there was anger, yeah, sharp and clean. She had lied to me. She had faked a medical emergency involving her own mother to manipulate me into coming home early. That's not something a person does on a whim. That takes planning. That takes a decision. Then, under the anger, there was something sadder. Because when I sat there and really thought about it, this wasn't just about one phone call. This was the endpoint of a pattern that I hadn't named properly before. The 6 weeks of guilt tripping. The comments about the money. The subtle digs. The thumbs-up emoji when I sent her a beautiful photo. All of it was pointing to the same thing, that Dana did not have the capacity to let me have something for myself without making it about her. And then under even that, there was something that I'm a little ashamed to admit, relief. Because I finally had clarity. After years of something being wrong but not being able to quite put my finger on it, I finally knew exactly what was wrong. And knowing what's wrong is terrifying and sad and also, in a strange way, freeing. I called Marcus and told him everything. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, So what are you going to do? I looked out the window at the narrow cobblestone street below. A woman was hanging laundry from a second-floor window. A cat was sitting on a doorstep across the way. The city was just going about its business, completely indifferent to my collapsing marriage. I'm going to finish my vacation, I said. I stayed for the full 12 days. And I want to tell you that those remaining 8 days were not entirely peaceful, because I'd be lying if I said they were. Dana texted. A lot. Some of the texts were apologetic. I know what I did was wrong. I panicked and made a terrible decision. Can we please talk? Those were hard to read because there was a part of me, the part that had spent 9 years building a life with this person, that wanted to believe her. Some of the texts were defensive. You're being cold. You would understand if you were more present in this marriage. I wouldn't have had to do this if you actually listened to me. Those were easier to deal with because they did a better job of reminding me of what I was dealing with. One text somewhere in the middle really stopped me cold. She wrote, I've been feeling invisible for years, and I thought if I just told you the truth you wouldn't care. So I made something up that I knew you couldn't ignore. I read that text about a dozen times over 2 days. Because here's the thing, and I want to be very honest about this even though it's uncomfortable, some of what she was saying wasn't coming from nowhere. I had been distracted. I had been burned out. I had been checked out of the marriage in a lot of ways. Was I the perfect husband? No. Were there things I should have been paying more attention to? Probably. But, and this is a really important but, feeling unheard is not a justification for lying about a family member's health to manipulate your partner. Those two things can both be true at the same time. She might have had real, legitimate feelings underneath the manipulation, and the manipulation can still be completely unacceptable. You don't get a pass on the behavior just because the feeling underneath it was real. I went on a long hike on day 8. There's a trail along the coast of Portugal called the Fisherman's Trail, and I did a section of it that took me about 6 hours. Cliffs, ocean, white sandy beaches, tiny fishing villages. I spent most of those 6 hours just thinking. By the time I got back to my rental apartment that evening, sunburned and exhausted and somehow clearer than I'd been in years, I had made a decision. I wasn't going back to the same life. Now let me zoom out because I think there's something here that goes beyond just my story and into something that a lot of people are going to recognize, whether they want to admit it or not. What Dana did is a specific type of behavior that therapists and psychologists call coercive control. I didn't know that term at the time, but I've done a lot of reading since, and it fits. Coercive control isn't always loud. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a long, slow pattern of making someone feel guilty for having their own needs, and then escalating to more drastic tactics when the subtle ones don't work. Research published in the journal Psychology of Violence found that coercive control is one of the most consistent predictors of long-term dissatisfaction and harm in intimate relationships. More so, in some studies, than even physical conflict. Because coercive control is invisible. It doesn't leave marks. It just slowly makes you feel like your needs are less important than your partner's, until one day you've forgotten you had needs at all. When I look back at my marriage through that lens, I see it everywhere. I see it in the way I stopped making plans with friends because it always seemed to upset Dana somehow. I see it in the way I defaulted to what she wanted on every vacation we ever took. I see it in the way I felt a spike of anxiety every time I wanted to spend money on myself. I see it in the way I felt guilty, actually guilty, for booking a solo trip to take care of my own mental health. None of those things were dramatic. None of them were events that would show up in a court document. But they added up. And by the time I was sitting on that bed in Lisbon with a packed bag at my feet, they had added up into 9 years. A 2023 report from the American Psychological Association notes that emotional manipulation in relationships often goes unidentified for years because the person experiencing it has gradually been conditioned to normalize it. The manipulation becomes the baseline. The guilt becomes the default. And by the time something big enough happens to break through that, you're already deep in. That phone call about Dana's mother broke through. I got back on a Sunday evening. Dana was home when I arrived. The house felt weird, like the air inside it had changed. I put my bag down in the hallway and we sat across from each other at the kitchen table, which is where we always had serious conversations. She had clearly prepared for this. She'd written notes on her phone, which she glanced at a few times. She led with an apology, and I want to give her credit, it was a real one, not one of those, "I'm sorry you felt that way" non-apologies. She said she knew what she did was wrong, that she had panicked and made an extremely poor decision, and that she was sorry for the pain it caused. I accepted the apology in the sense that I heard it and believed it was sincere. Then we talked. For 3 hours we talked. Dana told me about the loneliness she'd been feeling. The way she'd felt disconnected from me for a long time. The way she'd started to feel like she was an afterthought in my life. Some of it was hard to hear because it was true. I hadn't been present. I had been so consumed by work stress and burnout that I'd been running on empty in the marriage too. But then I talked. And I told her things I'd been swallowing for years. I told her about the way her constant need for control on vacations made them feel exhausting rather than restful. I told her about the way the 6 weeks before my trip had felt like a sustained campaign to make me feel guilty for wanting something for myself. I told her that what she did, faking a medical emergency involving her own mother, wasn't a panic move or a mistake. It was a choice. And it told me something about how she was willing to operate when she didn't get what she wanted. She cried. I didn't raise my voice. We weren't cruel to each other. It was just a long, hard, honest conversation that I think we'd both been avoiding for years. At the end of it, I told her I didn't know if I wanted to stay in the marriage. We agreed to start couples therapy. I also started individual therapy because, and I say this without any shame, I had some serious untangling to do on my own. Years of conditioning don't disappear after one honest conversation. The therapist we saw together was direct in a way that I appreciated. In our second session, she said something I haven't stopped thinking about. She said, a relationship can survive almost anything except one person consistently believing their needs matter more than their partner's. She wasn't saying that to Dana specifically. She said it in a way that applied to both of us, our patterns, our failures, our habits. But we both knew which of us had been carrying that belief in the more extreme form. I want to be honest about where things stand now because I know people want to know. I'm still living in the house with Dana but in a separate bedroom. We've had 7 therapy sessions as a couple and I've had 9 individual ones. There have been some really hard conversations. There have also been a few moments where I've seen something in Dana that reminded me of who she was when we first got together. More open, more willing to sit in discomfort, more willing to hear things she didn't want to hear. Whether those moments add up to something worth saving, I genuinely don't know yet. What I do know is this. I am not going back to the version of that marriage that existed before Lisbon. That version was slowly turning me into someone who felt guilty for wanting to be okay. I won't live in that version again. If the marriage continues, it will be a completely different one built on completely different foundations. And if it doesn't continue, if we get to the end of this process and the honest conclusion is that we're not right for each other, then I will be sad and I will grieve and I will also be okay. Because I know something now that I didn't know before I booked that flight. I know what it feels like to be okay. I'm going to step back from my personal story now and talk about some things I've learned through this whole experience, because I think they're actually useful. The first thing is this: burnout is not a personality flaw. When I finally talked to a therapist about what I'd been feeling for the past 2 years, one of the most important things she said was that the guilt I felt about needing rest was a symptom, not a moral verdict. The World Health Organization officially classified burnout as an occupational syndrome in 2019. It's real, it's documented, and it has specific symptoms: chronic exhaustion, reduced sense of accomplishment, a growing detachment from work and life. I had all 3 in a big way. But because I'd never sought help for it, and because I was in an environment where even wanting a vacation felt like something to be ashamed of, it had gone on and on. If you're reading this and you recognize yourself in what I was describing, the perpetual tiredness, the inability to enjoy things you used to love, the sense of just going through the motions, please take it seriously. Not because it's dramatic, but because it gets worse when ignored. Research from Stanford Medical Center suggests that burnout left unaddressed can evolve into clinical depression in a significant number of cases. Taking a break isn't weakness. Needing rest is not a character flaw. It's just biology. The second thing, guilt is not the same as responsibility. This is a subtle one, but it's important. In a healthy relationship, if your needs sometimes inconvenience your partner, you might feel a small, appropriate amount of guilt. That's normal human empathy. But if you feel crushing guilt every time you try to do something for yourself, if the guilt is completely out of proportion to any actual harm you're causing, that's worth examining. Because guilt can be used as a tool. It can be applied gradually and strategically until the person on the receiving end starts to police themselves so thoroughly that the person applying it doesn't even have to do it anymore. You just do their job for them automatically every time you consider meeting your own needs. I had been doing that job for Dana for years. The 6-week guilt campaign before my trip was just the moment it became visible enough for me to see it. The third thing, the people who love you should want you to be well. This sounds obvious. I know it sounds obvious, but it's shocking how easy it is to forget when you're in the middle of a relationship that's slowly eroding your sense of self. A person who loves you wants you to feel rested. They want you to have time to yourself. They want you to be able to pursue things that make you feel alive. They will sometimes miss you when you're away. They might even feel a little left out sometimes. Those are all normal feelings. But if those feelings consistently override any concern for your well-being, if "I miss you" always wins over "I want you to be okay," that's something you need to look very hard at. The fourth thing, you can love someone and still not be able to stay with them. This was the hardest one for me, because I did love Dana. I still do in some form. We spent 9 years building a life together. There are 1,000 good memories in that house. None of that disappears. But love isn't enough on its own. Love without mutual respect. Love without being able to see each other as full people with separate needs. Love that one person uses as leverage over another. That kind of love is not sustainable. It will eventually consume whoever is on the receiving end of it. I don't know if that's where Dana and I end up, but I know that I'm not willing to sacrifice myself to find out. If you're in a situation that looks anything like mine, feeling guilty for your own needs, walking on eggshells, wondering if wanting to rest makes you a bad partner, I want to say this directly to you. You are not asking for too much when you ask for the right to have a break. You are not being selfish when you want time that belongs entirely to you. You are not a bad partner for having needs that sometimes don't involve the other person. And if someone is consistently making you feel like you are, that's information about them, not about you. The trip to Lisbon was the best decision I made in years. Not because Lisbon is beautiful, although it really is. Not because I needed a vacation, although I really did. But because it created the space, physical, mental, emotional, for me to finally see my own life clearly. Distance has a way of doing that. When you're inside something all the time, you can't see its shape. Going away helped me see the shape of my life. And what I saw told me I needed to change it. If there is a trip you've been putting off, an experience you've been suppressing because someone else in your life has made you feel guilty for wanting it, I am telling you as plainly as I can to go. Not to run away from your problems. Not to avoid hard conversations. Not to pretend everything is fine when it isn't. But because you matter. Your mental health matters. Your joy matters. And no relationship worth having should require you to sign those things away. It's been about 4 months since I got back from Lisbon. I'm still in therapy. I've lost 12 of the 20 pounds I'd gained. I've been going for long walks in the evenings, not because I'm training for anything, just because I like being outside and moving. I've been reading more. I've been sleeping better. I've set clearer boundaries at work. I actually took a long weekend trip with Marcus 2 months ago. Just a road trip up north, nothing fancy, and I didn't feel guilty about it once. Dana and I are still in couples therapy. We are still in the same house in separate rooms. Whether we end up together or not, I think we've both grown from the process, even though the growing has been painful. The most honest thing I can tell you is that I don't know how this ends. I don't know if my marriage survives this or not. I don't know if Dana and I rebuild something real or if we realize, eventually, that we've been holding on to something that was broken for longer than either of us admitted. What I know is that I'm not going to disappear into someone else's needs again. Not because I've decided to stop caring about other people, but because I finally understand that taking care of yourself isn't the opposite of loving someone. It's actually the prerequisite. You can't pour from an empty cup. I know that's a cliché. I know everybody says it. But I was literally pouring from an empty cup for years, and I genuinely thought that was what love was supposed to feel like. I thought love was supposed to be hard. I thought marriage was supposed to require constant sacrifice. I thought feeling depleted was just the cost of commitment. It isn't. And nobody should have to book a flight to Portugal to figure that out. But sometimes that's what it takes. Here's the thing I keep coming back to. This story isn't really about a fake emergency. It isn't really about a solo trip to Europe. It isn't even really about my marriage, not at its core. It's about what happens when you spend too long ignoring your own needs. What happens when you let guilt become the primary operating system of your life. What happens when the person who is supposed to be your partner starts to treat your well-being as a threat to their comfort. And it's about what happens when you finally stop. When you finally say, I need something. I'm going to ask for it. And when someone tries to take it from you through lies and manipulation, you're not going to fold. You're going to sit in a small apartment in Lisbon with your unpacked bag at your feet, and you're going to call back and say, I'm not coming home. That moment right there was the moment something changed in me. Not just in my marriage. In me. I had spent years waiting for someone to give me permission to be okay. To take care of myself. To rest. And what I finally understood, sitting on that bed in Portugal, was that nobody was ever going to give me that permission. I had to take it. So I did. And whatever happens next, whether my marriage survives or doesn't, whether Dana and I figure it out or not, I am not going back to the person I was before that trip. That person was slowly being erased. And I liked who I was starting to become instead. If this story hit close to home for you, watch the next video on the screen right now. You need to hear what comes next.